Ladies and gentlemen, this is a very special, very unusual gathering, organised in harness, as David has said, with the Savile Row Concours just over the road. And I think it's appropriate and it's humbling to be meeting in this wonderful place, the Royal Academy of Arts. When the Academy was founded 250 years or more ago, something like the motor car could not have been imagined. But today, the motor car is universal, and for the great majority, it's merely an instrument of convenience. It's a beast of burden. For most people, something as exciting as a washing machine or a lawnmower. Yet, in this building, devoted to the visual arts, we've come together to discuss whether a motor car could ever be considered a work of art. Now, we have on our distinguished panel, and I guess also in the audience, people who need no persuading that a Bugatti Type 57 or a 2900C Alfa Romeo or even the more familiar E-Type Jaguar is indeed a work of art. So let me introduce the eminent people who are going to voice what they think about all of this. It's only right that we should have an important artist on the panel, so we're delighted to welcome Humphrey Ocean, an exciting and innovative painter of half a century. He was elected a Royal Academician in 2004, but he's also a motion enthusiast, and some of his most challenging works have a representation of car shapes. Callum CBE, there he is renowned as one of the world's great automotive designers, responsible for cars as varied as the Ford Escort RS Cosworth, the Aston Martin DB7, and a whole generation of Jaguars from the XF to the I-Pace. And in 2019, he founded his own automotive design consultancy, Callum. His background's very much in art, culminating in graduation from the Royal College of Art, and then with a master's degree in vehicle design. Now, Hagerty, as the foremost firm specialising in the insurance of classic and collector cars, have to know what their clients' cars are really worth. And nobody knows more about the classic car market, what's going up, what's going down, which are the sleepers, than John Mayhead. Here he is. He edits Hagerty's Price Guide UK, which is the market's most authoritative valuation tool. Now, when you're buying a house, you make sure that all the searches are done, your solicitor has drawn up all the contracts correctly. Of course, many of these cars now cost as much as 5 houses. Yet it's extraordinary that people often buy them with their heart instead of their head. They hand over a pile of cash without doing the thing properly. And chassis numbers, histories, even whole cars can be forged. And the value of an important car can be fraudulently inflated for a credulous purchaser by an unscrupulous vendor. Well, the long-established law firm Healys have their own classic car department, which is headed up by Clive Robertson, and he's had to act in many high-profile cases relating to classic cars. Furthermore, today's values of some classic cars make them hugely significant assets, attracting all sorts of issues when it comes to succession planning and inheritance. And that's the special area of expertise of Chartered Tax Advisor Susan Spash, who is personal tax and inheritance specialist at Blick Rothenberg. And if collector cars can be considered works of art, then they are vulnerable to the same sorts of criminal activity that are all too well known in the art world. Julian Radcliffe, OBE, is chairman of both the Art Loss Register and now the Classic Car Register. The Art Loss Register is the due diligence provider for the art market, maintains the largest private database of stolen art, antiques and collectibles in the world. Whether or not classic cars can be art, they can be stolen, forged or hidden away. So he's now founded the Classic Car Register, and with an immense database of valuable cars around the world. Ladies and gentlemen, your panel. Now, I think we should start with the question enshrined in the title of this seminar: can an old car be a work of art? Let's go first to Humphrey Ocean, because he is an artist. He knows what is a work of art. I'm sure most artists disagree about what is a work of art, but can Humphrey, a motor car, be a work of art?
I would make a distinction. I think a car, a beautiful car, we would call a work of art. But I'm just going to clarify where I come from. Cars are not art. Art is useless. The uselessness of what I do, I wear as a badge of honour. But when I look at, for instance, out at the back, the Ferrari 250 GT. I went to the Design Museum a few years ago. They had a wonderful Ferrari exhibition there. And they had not a red one of those, but it was the one that was owned by Peter Collins, the great racing driver, who, when he bought it, he died the next year, not in that car. But he painted his British racing green. And it is so beautiful that I was almost down on my knees. I spent quite a lot of time on my knees. I fell on my knees this morning because I'm sitting quite near Ian Callum, who designed the car that I drive. And
Stop it.
Beneath this mild exterior is a slightly flash so-and-so, so I love. Also, I'm very fascinated, as Simon says, by the fact that we all drive cars, and everyone who protests about cars and petrol and this and that, whatever, hands up all those who are protesting, who haven't been in a car this year to get to where they are. It's just a given, and the difference between me and Rembrandt is Rembrandt didn't know 60 miles an hour. There are other differences, by the way, between me and Rembrandt, but in short, also, the Ford Fairlane, I've got a moment, I'm on stage, I'm going to boast. In the British Museum at the moment, I've got a drawing of a Ford Fairlane Skyliner, I think that is 1957. To me, the car is a work of art. My drawing that I spent 2 weeks drawing in 1974, rotting in Leighton Buzzard, my drawing is art. It's not for me to say, it's like being when one says that is poetic, one doesn't mean it's a poem. Or did you want the short answers?
Well, maybe we'll have a short answer towards the end, but after what you've said, I've got to go to Ian Callum, because you have designed cars of all sorts, from comparatively humble Ford Escorts up to you've got a superb Aston Martin parked up the road, which is an Aston Martin which you have added a bit of Callum consultancy to.
Yes.
So, first question, do you think cars can be art? And secondly, have you ever, in your work, when you've been designing cars, have you had in the back of your mind a Bugatti Atlantic Coupe or whatever it might be, a great car of the past?
Bugatti, probably not. I remember when we were designing the Vanquish, as you mentioned. I was inspired that it was a Hagerty before GT, and there was a touch of that, but it was inspiration. And inspiration drives you in a certain direction of attitude rather than copying. So yeah, I do get inspired by other cars, and I got inspired by other forms of design. When we design cars, the notion of art is very much in our mind. We want to make every line, every form as beautiful, at least I do, as beautiful as we can make it within the constraints of a car. There's no denying that, and I really believe if you can design anything, whether it be a car or anything else, it only deserves the best. Oops, I'm off now. Is that working? Yeah. It only deserves the best. There's no excuse for bad design. And so every line, every form, proportion, whatever it might be, deserves a maximum effort in an artistic way.
But a motor car has to be functional
yes,
as well. So is there ever a conflict between how you want to make it work or how you want to make it look and how it's got to work.
Always. But I was thinking about this, and if you think of older cars, which we tend to be talking about here, they start off as cars first and foremost, you know, and the designers and the engineers involved are creating an object with some element of beauty in them, and therefore art. But with the constraints of something, it has to be a motor car. That's its primary function, and it's a motor car. Now what happens is, through the space of time, the functions become less relevant and the beauty becomes more relevant. Let's take an E-Type. It was designed by Malcolm Self, who was an aerodynamicist. And the reason that car is so pure, because it was done mathematically. He wasn't aesthetic, he did understand things. He had pictures of Disco Volantes in his walls, so there was something there. But he derived that car through mathematics. So that's where its purity comes from. And the reality is, his aerodynamics were completely flawed. It's a terrible car aerodynamically. But he didn't know that at the time. So the aerodynamics, the function of the car, whether it be a Ferrari 250 short wheelbase or the E-Type or anything of that era which looks beautiful, the raison d'etre becomes less important and the art becomes more important. That's what happens in my mind. The aerodynamics E-Type don't matter anymore. You buy it because it's beautiful. And what's interesting is, if you're going to buy an E-Type, you buy Series 1 because it's beautiful. You don't buy Series 2 or even the Series 3, you might do, but because that is the most beautiful of them. So the beauty overtakes all the other aspects of it. And
Although it doesn't drive as well.
I don't think that's why people buy them.
Sure.
People buy cars because of that ilk, because they just look so good.
So that's fascinating. The car becomes art
In my
when
mind,
it becomes
art.
less useful.
Yes.
Which ties in with what Humphrey was saying, because he says art is useless. But maybe we'll come back to that today. I'm just going to move on to values now. John, what's going to happen to classic car values? We know that Mercedes 300 SLR coupe sold for £114 million sterling. What's going on?
Can I just pick up on a couple of things that you've already said? I talk about values, that's my day job. I'm a writer at heart, so I like creating things of shit paper, really, but that entertain people. And I think in order to understand where the value of something like that comes in, you have to go back to this, whether it is art or not. And I agree, I don't think cars are art. I think that art is a combination of narrative and beauty. And I think the narrative of a car comes from its being driven. And interestingly, you said about the first generation of the E-Type being a mathematical design, is when you get those absolutely beautiful cars, so the Jarre Silver Arrows pre-war, even through to the McMurtry fan car, the Bat cars, the Alpha Bat cars, all of those are people's control, or trying to shape natural forces. So wind resistance, ground resistance, and so it's almost the beauty of nature rubs off a little bit. And I think that for me is where you get that beauty, and then that beauty then transforms into value. There are loads of things that add value to a car. One is beauty. One is exclusivity. And then the last thing I think is this kind of, a few of us in the car world, many people here in the car world, and we kind of know instinctively that a Mark 1, an early Series 1 E-Type is the one to have, and the flat floor, the outside bonnet look car. But actually why? And if you step back from that, and you gave a story of how that car is developed, then that's what gets human emotion going, and that's where you get pure value, I think, in something as a work of art, as something which is artistic. And I think the Mercedes is a great example of that. This is a one-off. This was the designer's car. It was driven. It was such a special car and very beautiful.
But this whole rarity thing is fascinating, because it seems to me, we seem to be talking too much about E-Types, but continuing with the E-Type, if the Series 1 E-Type, if they'd made 17 rather than however many thousands, then presumably it would be immensely valuable now. It would be worth millions rather than hundreds of thousands.
Well, I don't know, because the very first, the outside body block ones, the ones in the world, there are only a handful of those, and they are worth a lot more.
Yeah.
But there has to be there is a very small group of people, I think, who really appreciate that or want that, whereas there are other attributes of the car which maybe are wider. There's one of the things we do every year called panellists, which is we look at celebrity links with cars, the actual car, and see how much that is worth differently. And I did some research for this about art cars, and it's the similar sort of thing. An art car adds value, obviously, to the base level car. People don't, people buy into the story. They buy into the story of Steve McQueen's Mustang, or all of those sort of cars that have been in a film, or and you think, I'm that person again. You're the next person in that movie.
Okay, well now I want to talk about things going wrong. I said in the introduction that you can have crime, you can have fraud, you can have all sorts of disappointments, to say the least, in the classic car business. Clive, let me come to you, because it was you who said that line I had earlier, that if you buy a house, you're very careful about it. If you buy a car, you may be very flip and very fast moving about it. So what are the legal arguments involved if somebody sells a car and the man who buys it decides that it's not what he thought he was buying? What happens then?
Can I begin in a slightly different place? If I, in my last 15 years, collected some of the stories and cases that I've been involved in, I probably have enough material for a further run of Fake or Fortune. That sounds slightly dramatic, but it is the case. People come to buy their pride and joy, let's say the 61 E-Type flat for one of the first 75. Sometimes they look at it, it's exactly what it's meant to be, the description that they're given is correct. Their heart takes over and they spend a considerable sum of money. So several years later they go to sell it and they find it. And everybody is around here thinking, well, why would anybody ridiculously go out and buy a car and not deal with it properly? But it happens all the time. So what needs to be done is there needs to be a contract for starting point, setting out the rights, what goes wrong if it's not the right car, especially dealers involved, you need a contract. Then you need to carry out searches, as you said, just like a house. You need to check the provenance, the history. You need to see all the right experts if it's a well-known car. You need to have the car absolutely crawled over with a microscope. It may sound bonkers, but there's plenty of forensics around today. You can measure paint, you can measure the age of paint. You can take a chip of metal out of a chassis and you can date it to an exact year. And those background elements all pulled together tell you whether you've got a right car or not. The seller, if he's a dealer, will be getting fed up and saying he's got another offer for it. But if it's the right car, he'll wait. But the lesson for me is I would be less busy, unfortunately, if people went about this properly. You'd never buy a flat or a house without seeing your solicitor first. You'd never turn up with the money because you had a lovely lawn and swimming pool. So there is a little bit of insanity amongst all of us, seeing the beautiful car, saying, we have to have that one, we have to have it now.
Well, good sense. Now let's think about what happens when things do go wrong. Cars can be stolen, cars can lie low for 20 years and then reappear, maybe with a better provenance than they had when they disappeared. And of course, cars, as we hear, can be forged. So let me bring you in, Julian. How does your role come in there?
In the art world, we've proved that a database which is available to everybody to check when they buy, sell, insure, lend or whatever, can reduce crime, both stolen items being sold and therefore make it more difficult for people to sell a stolen item, which means they don't find it such a profitable business, and secondly to reduce fakes and frauds. And the classic car industry is based, I believe, to a significant extent on the provenance of the car. That has a very significant impact on the value. So our concept is to put together in a database all the available provenance we can. So we have 390,000 records from sports car market in America, 2,000 auction catalogues digitized, so you can search by make, model number, chassis number, VIN number, etc. We don't say this car is good, bad or indifferent. We merely say what is the source of that information, and you need to check that and make your own judgment on the credibility of that data. But we're pretty certain from talking to the major auction houses and dealers that this will improve the classic car industry, reduce disputes, which may not be good for the lawyers, but hopefully will be good for everybody else, and will bring the classic car industry in the only area where I see that it's behind the art world, bring it up to the same level. And if I can just pick up on one point, decorative art, which is defined as those items which are used or useful and are then decorated and made to look nice, is always considered by the artists who produce fine art, paintings or sculpture, to be, not being rude about the academicians, but it's always considered to be a slightly lesser degree of art. But that is what a car is. That is what a car is. It's a useful object which has been made beautiful, which is designed to be beautiful, in exactly the same way as a candlestick or a beautiful silver salver. So cars, in my view, are art.
Right, well, let's now explore all of that, because Humphrey said, rather a splendid short line, art is useless. And I mean, we could debate that specifically all day. But the thing that always depresses me, because I think if you have a wonderful car, whether it's art or not, the joy comes in driving it. The joy comes out of getting out of bed at 4 o'clock on a summer's morning and driving it 300 miles and feeling what the designer, the mechanical designer and the stylist wanted that car to do. Unfortunately, because of the investment values, and they seem ever to be rising, we now have a situation where cars, you can't hang them on the wall, or I only know of one person who actually hung a car on the wall like a picture. But they are being used, the valuable cars, less and less. Either they're being polished and shown off to dinner party guests when you have some people round and you take them to the garage and say, look at that. Or even worse, they're hidden away and never appear. And I read the other day about a Ferrari. This was quite a recent modern Ferrari. I think it was 14 years old. In those 14 years, it had driven 19 miles and had had 4 owners. So it was purely rather as wine is bought, not to be drunk, but to be dealt and invested in. So I wanted to move that slightly to, I mean, should we be hanging cars on the wall if we're not prepared to drive them? Ian, I'm going to come to you first.
Because, you know, getting back to the aesthetic, it matters to me, obviously. A flat floor E-type means nothing. I know what it is, of course, and what I know all that stuff, but whether it's a flat floor or not, it doesn't make any difference to me. I buy it because of the aesthetic, or I own one because of it. Yeah, I've got a car on the wall, but as long as I'd rather drive it. Yeah, cool.
Do you think it's a good thing that cars should be bought and hidden away?
No, I
as
don't.
investment?
No, I don't. I think cars should be enjoyed.
Yeah.
And I certainly buy cars to enjoy first of all. foremost. I enjoy the aesthetic of them. You talk about 4 o'clock in the morning scenario. I've done it many times. My favourite car for that, incidentally, and some cringe at this, but is a TR6. I love TR6s. So I got 4 o'clock in the morning, driving in Warwickshire for 3 hours, sun's coming up. It's just a wonderful, wonderful experience.
Well,
You're
that's
part of that
superb
story.
because, I mean, I can ask John quickly to give us a figure, but, you know, a TR6 is not a Ferrari GTO. What's a TR6?
20 grand.
20 to 40 grand, absolute tops.
Well, actually, mine's insured with you for 22 grand.
Oh,
It's worth a lot more. So triple wipers on it, put a lot of work into it, but that's...
Humphrey, should cars be hung on the wall and not used?
Used and, you know, they are, it's a bit like art. You know, I don't like art that's put into banks and not enjoyed. You know, you might as well have an ISA. You know, have a car, get into it, enjoy it. I love the experience of driving. I relate to. I started off with Morris cars and Travellers and that sort of thing. I went on to a Volvo Amazon and then went on to Saab. Don't get me started about Saab, or we will be here till 4 o'clock in the morning. But when I saw The Godfather in 1972 or something, the cars in that, which are, you know, older than really the cars, I like the cars that are made in you know, since I was born, much more. But I got into my Morris Traveller, coming out of the cinema, and drove this as if it was a 1936 Buick or 1950, whatever it was. It felt so wonderful. And again, just to sort of translate that, for instance, you know, not the E-Type, to come, my first Saab was so beautiful. Apparently it was something called ergonomic. I think all cars legally should be ergonomic because they are designed for us. We should feel totally comfortable in our enjoyment because they are lethal weapons, cars. But I used to see other people in Saabs, even though I had one myself, and think, lucky them, they're enjoying what I'm enjoying.
One thing that we absolutely haven't covered yet, because we all spend as much as we can afford. I think most of us spend far too much, probably what we can't afford. We build up cars that are appreciating. Then what happens either when we die or when we want to avoid all sorts of difficulties and we start to leave them to our children before we die. So Susan, tell us about all of that. That is a murky area, isn't it?
Well, the starting point is probably quite clear in as much as if you die and you pass a lovely car worth hundreds of thousands of pounds or a Saab that may not be worth quite as much to the next generation. Let's assume for the moment that we're not leaving it to surviving spouse or civil partner. Then you are going to be into the world of inheritance tax. The problem is that inheritance tax is 40% of the value. Talk to valuers. We have to get a real valuation and then we get to pay basically 40% inheritance tax. It seems a real shame. And it's peaks and troughs of valuation. So, you know, as generations move forward and people buy cars that they aspire to own when they were teenagers, you know, we'll have cars that perhaps our parents aspire to owning. Perhaps their values might fall away slightly, but then we'll have waves, I think, she says, talking completely out of my knowledge box. So, you know, depending on when you die, you know, the amount that you're going to pay your inheritance tax on can be significantly different from perhaps something 6 months earlier or 12 months later.
What do you mean, because the car's gone up or down in value?
Yeah, according to popularity, or because somebody famous drove it, or it was seen in a film. All of these things that we're talking about. And by the way, I'm going to upset all the wealth managers in the room. I do think that an ISA is not half as exciting as if you're having a car parked in a garage. By the way. So what can we do? So if you give it away before you die, you're giving away something that's potentially exempt transfer, potentially exempt if you survive the 7 years. Probably a lot of people in the room will know this. Survive 7 years, giving it away, absolutely. But you can't get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and go for a ride because you've given it to somebody else, so it's not yours anymore. And if you do get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and take the keys out of the safe and off you go, then you have reserved a benefit, and therefore for inheritance tax you have not given it away. The good thing is, unlike the family home, because it's a chattel, you can carve out future use, future enjoyment. You can pay a rent, and if you've got a really expensive car, the rent to be able to go 6 months of the year on a Sunday morning or whatever on a drive, compared to the 40% inheritance tax, might be quite affordable. So you can rent, you have to pay market value. Or you could give it away but carve out some sort of life interest for the next 10 years so you carry on using it. Again, you have to pay market rent.
But if you've given your car to your son, but you want to go on using it, and the taxman says you've got to pay for using it, how on earth is that calculated? I mean, you can't go to your local Hearst or Avis and hire a Ferrari GTO. So
well,
how much do you pay?
Not your local Hearst. There are specialist car firms that you can hire from, or you speak to an expert who will tell you what is the
Fortunately, I've never been asked that.
After today, you'll have them on the phone to
Absolutely.
you. So it may be, it has to be, but it does have to be market rate. And it's one of these things where it's an all or nothing. If you only pay a peppercorn, it's not, you might as well not pay the peppercorn.
Right. Okay, now there's another whole area. We've talked a little bit about forgeries, about cars that aren't what they're meant to be. There's another fascinating area, which is where cars are quite honestly replicas. Some manufacturers who own the copyright to their cars have now realised they can make a lot of money. Jaguar, for example, have made D-type Jaguars and XKSSs. But because they're new, they are Jaguars because they're made by Jaguar. But because they're made in 2023, they have to comply with all the ridiculous rules and regulations we have driving a new car on the road. And unless you hang fog lights and all sorts of other bits and pieces on your new D-type Jaguar, you're not allowed to drive it on the road. So that's all a little bit ridiculous, particularly as you probably paid Jaguar $1.5 million. Now, we know that there are companies that make replicas. Some of them are very bad, some of them are really rather good. And they don't pretend, they're not forgeries, they don't pretend to be anything else. So I'm going to talk really to the two of you about what all of this means. Can we start off with what happens if Jaguar Land Rover take exception to a perfectly honourable company that's been making SS100 tribute cars, not replicas, for 20 years, and then Jaguar Land Rover decide they want to stop them?
Well, quite simply, if they can prove the ownership of the design rights and the model, they can take action. And probably everybody here knows they have done. And they started, well, they probably started in 2018, and I think they started to realise the value in their history, if you like, and creating these wonderful new copies, which cost a fortune, which can't drive on the road. So they're looking to protect that. So they started by sending cease and desist letters to all sorts of interesting people, least of which being a lady in Norfolk who had produced a range of 50 greetings cards, but had a lovely watercolour of a Land Rover prancing through fields. And she actually got a cease and desist letter. Now, I don't know, her profit for that might have been £32, I have no idea, but that seemed to me to be an extraordinary thing to do. But at another level...
Did Jaguar win that case?
Well, no, because the letter was a cease and desist letter saying, if you don't cease and desist, we will come after you. So I think everybody knows here that they picked on a lovely couple of people in Sweden called the Magnussons, who had made a copy of one car. They'd been talking to Jaguar about it and making another couple of copies. and Jaguar seemed to be very happy about this. Then they got a cease and desist letter, and Jaguar issued proceedings against them, and they won. And there was substantial damages awarded and costs, and there was an order to be confirmed subsequently that the car should be destroyed.
But then what happened?
Well, most people might have shrunk away and said, no, sorry, we haven't got the backbone or the will or the funding to fight the massive JLR, but they didn't, and quite a good lot of publicity came behind her, because Jaguar's actions in writing these cease and desist letters had created a well of poor feeling. So they had lots of support from all sorts of people, funding, expert advice and so forth. Anyway, so they went to appeal and they won. The order was turned over, the car didn't have to be destroyed, the damages and costs were to be assessed, and everybody thought this is absolutely wonderful. And yes, it was for the Magnusons. But most of the market doesn't understand that the real outcome of that case was that the appeal court decided that Jaguar had copyright in the Sayers C-type design, and that was effective not only in Sweden but in England. Now, I have to say that's questionable, and courts don't like being told what to do from other countries' jurisdictional decisions, so that might remain to be overturned, but that's the reality of the case. Jaguar won.
Obviously these replicas are around in the market, and when I say replicas, these are cars that are quite honestly declared to be exactly what they are. What about the value of a very well-made Jaguar D-type replica, for example? I mean, they never approach the value, do they, of the real thing?
No, is the short answer to that. But it goes back to what we were talking about, in that there is a design element, but there is also the story comes from its history and its driving and its provenance, and you can create that. So if you have one of these and you drive it, and you drive it on track, and you drive it to events, and you're enjoying that car and the design, then you are building its story, and other people might buy into that story and actually appreciate it. And the other thing is because they are inherently cheaper is the wrong word, less valuable than the what's called the original, then actually they are probably more usable. I had spoken to a 250 GTO owner who said, I'm really worried about using the real one for on track now, because it is so important as a thing. They said, it is a racing car, it's been dented and bent over the years, but now it's getting harder and harder to justify more of those. Whereas actually, if I had a replica of that, I would race the pants off of it.
And in fact, if we're thinking of the same man, he then had a replica made, so he had two identical GTOs.
Yeah.
One which he polished and kept in a garage, and one he enjoyed.
And then you get to this point of, well, there is a blurring of lines there. I think it's very interesting when you were talking about having a list. The issue with a car is that whether it's original or not, you've got to take the parts off of that and replace them regularly to keep it doing what it's supposed to be doing. And also in the past we have very, very different rules of the game. So if you go pre-war, there's a car out there, I spoke to its owner yesterday, that was raced pre-war. It was split into two different cars. There are two cars with the same chassis number. The owner owns both of them now. That's great news, but that's just what happened. There wasn't a nefarious situation, and there were new bits on both of those cars. It's when I am asked, we do a lot of commercial valuations for finance companies who say, we're putting out a lot of money on this car, what is it? And is it really worth this much money? And it is as much of an art as a science to work the value into that, because you have to know as much of that story as you can. You have to trust some of the people that you can trust, who will tell you that it's the right bit and it hasn't just been re-stamped last year, or you know, in somewhere else in the world, and then you've got to put it all together, but it's still a best estimate.
Although, of course, people, if they're buying a toy, it's what they want to pay. It's what they think it's worth. It's not something that it's not like an ISA or whatever it might be. I wanted to ask about wristwatches because I think, Julian, you also work in that area.
Yes,
a wristwatch.
40
watches with a badge on, which may say Philippe Patek or whatever. Are the manufacturers deliberately trying to fraudulently pretend that is a real watch, or are they openly making a replica?
It's very interesting. The attitude of the makers of watches has gone through a very fundamental change very recently. For many years, the watchmakers did not make a huge effort to conquer fakes and stop them. In fact, when I was in Switzerland, the head of one of the watchmakers said to me, when I pointed out that there were 6,000 fake watches of his in a shipment from Turkey that we could stop, he said, I have to congratulate my marketing department on the fact that so many people want to buy a watch with this name. And he said, we're not that worried about it, we don't think we can do much about it, and we're confident that our dealers are selling our watches at a very high price. Subsequently, he was found to have destroyed some watches in order to maintain the market, which is a matter which now would not be probably looked on with favour. And when we said, will you cooperate with us in giving the numbers of watches so that we get the numbering system right on our system and tell us if you know of a stolen watch, they weren't that interested because 1/3 of all the new watches sold are sold to people who've had a watch stolen. So reducing
the insurance
theft.
company is paying.
Sorry?
The insurance company is paying.
The insurance companies pay, but more importantly than that, if you're making new watches and 1/3 of your sales are the people who've had a watch stolen, reducing theft is not a very profitable business. So we were faced with the fact that even though they would never say this publicly, we knew that this was in their psyche. The whole thing changed overnight when the theft of watches in the street, including the murder of the man by St. Paul's Cathedral, when he came out of dinner with a security guard at the restaurant, having warned the gang to come and take him, turned out to be a fake Patek Philippe.
And they killed him for it.
They killed him. The watchmakers suddenly realized that wearing a watch was now not a great thing to do in public, and that was going to adversely affect sales. And there were murmurs in the insurance industry that we, the insurance industry, were finding watches uninsurable, and it's got to be in the safe, and that does not encourage watch collecting. So suddenly, we, having been the only people in the world trying to do something, well, not the only, but the main people in the world doing something about watch theft, some of the watchmakers started saying, we'll run a database of stolen watches, but it has a little thing to it which we don't do in the same way. They want the name of people who own watches before they lose them in order to sell them more watches. So the whole thing is designed to sell watches, not to reduce theft. So that's the sort of thing we have to cope with. In the classic car industry, I've met none of that sort of dual standard.
Ian, how would you feel if, and I mean it may well be happening or have happened, how would you feel about people replicating your design?
Flattered. Do you know what? I never really thought about it because we're talking about cars of a different era, and for that reason, that's where the value comes from. I've often thought about what cars are being built today that in 50 years' time are worth a lot more. I have no idea. People ask me this. I think I would feel uneasy about it, yes. But with a period of time, 50 years, which I think is where the copyright lies, and incidentally, C-Type is more than that. It's a very complicated story, as you know.
Yeah.
It's a work of art, which is 75 years, interestingly.
Oh, that's interesting.
But I would
Let's
feel
just understand this. copyright is 50 years, but copyrighted work of art is 75.
I believe it's in that region, yeah, it's longer than the
Is
car.
that right?
Yes.
Yes, it's a very complicated issue. The court spent hours on it.
But I mean, the other thing about modern cars is they are harder to replicate because they're quite complicated.
Hugely complicated.
I mean, the thing about a Ferrari GTO is it's a couple of tubes, an easily available engine and chassis bits, and a body which a very clever panel beater can replicate precisely. But I suppose
If you wanted to replicate an F-Type, it was almost impossible, really, because the amount of investment, we'd have to go back to the basic investment that Django put in, which is probably approaching £500 million. So it would be very, very difficult to replicate it properly. Now, if somebody put a fiberglass body on a rudimentary chassis, I would feel insulted, yes, because it doesn't really meet the notion, the true notion of the car that it's meant to be.
what about, Humphrey, forgeries in the art world? I mean, have there been forgeries of your work?
I've seen something extremely suspect on eBay, and which wasn't mine, but it pretended to be mine. I felt a bit like Ian, slightly flattered. I want to say something to Julian, because I want to not fall out at this stage in our friendship. Because I do not have a hierarchy about, art and design. To me, the Italian word disegno, drawing, which is, spatial awareness.
I withdraw my remark.
No, I like it's what's happened to art and why it's forged, and of course cars, as it were, are catching up with it, so they're forged as well. It's got a position in the world where we feel rather reverent towards it, and we think we have to understand it. We don't feel we have to understand cars, we feel we have to understand art. Actually, when we enjoy art, we understand ourselves. But the thing about, when you look at a constable, you don't say, oh, that's a nice painting of a tree. You say, that's a constable. I hope that one day somebody will come past my car and say, that is an Ian Callum, not a Jaguar Sport Brake.
I thought you were going to say you hope somebody will look at your painting and say, that's an ocean.
Occasionally they do. It's taken me 72 years to reach that, as it were. It's a very slow game. Cars can't, it's quicker, as it were. Art, I don't recommend it, by the way. You have to be desperate or chronically unemployable, which is
What about the critics? What about, for example, that rather rude man with a long European name who writes for the Sunday Times, who is very rude about some artists and says that is good art and that is bad art? Why does he have the authority to say that?
You will. I rest my case. He doesn't. A gold standard in art does not exist. The goalposts keep shifting all the time. Fantastic. That's how it should be. You go to the V&A and you can see the development of the human brain. That's what I love about cars, is they've come into existence, and there is a narrative, there is thinking behind them. It's so close, as it were, to what I do.
Okay, now we haven't got a lot of time left. I've been in the fortunate position of being able to ask all the questions, but we have got a couple of microphones around, lots of hands going up. If you shout loudly, you may not need the microphone, so let's see if our panel can hear you.
Yes, a question for Ian and Humphrey. You talked about modern cars briefly and quite a lot about old cars, but in the design of a relatively modern car, like, for example, the Vanquish, how much would the artistic side of you be constrained by having to work with the engineers who are working on, say, the ride handling and crash structures? By the way, you may not remember, but I was program director at Lotus for the Vanquish.
Yes, I do. Yes.
And
Well, you know that answer then.
I do have a perspective, but obviously I'm not an artist.
Were you colleagues or enemies?
Ian won't remember me, I was in the back.
No, we developed the car with Lotus, and it's always a great experience. For me, designing and developing a car is a journey. It's a journey I hugely enjoy. And it's very much about toing and froing. Now, I'm fortunate in that I understand the engineering side of a car quite well. And I can then go and have a debate about what goes and what doesn't go.
Should these things be artificial? Who wants to talk about that? Yeah.
Interesting story, I won't mention the brand, but they used to put little pouches and pockets of raw leather underneath the seats to get, because once you process leather in a car, it's beyond any smell, it becomes neutral. But to give the smell back, they put these little pouches of raw leather into. Now they don't do it in China because the Chinese don't like the smell of leather. Interesting, isn't it? So, but smell in modern cars is so dumbed down now because of the processes. You always have to create that smell. All the cars have natural smells because nobody was dumbing down
But the sound is dumbed down. Should that be artificial?
Yeah, when we did the F-Type, I'm sorry to reference Jaguar, but it's really all I know, but we have a sound studio, a room half the size of this with like a recording studio, where the sound experts create the noise that we want out of the exhaust pipe. Now it's real sound, it's not fake, they're just the algorithms of how they create it with the various channels and everything, create a certain sound. And if you've driven an F-Type and you start it up, it goes, you wake up your neighbours at 4 o'clock in the morning. And that became a problem, and they thought that algorithm had to change not to do that. And then they dumbed the sound down afterwards because some people didn't like the noise. But when you put the button down to make the noise louder, it's actually a mechanical switch, it's not artificial. But you're right, some manufacturers do it through the speakers, which is absurd. Absolutely absurd.
Okay, what about another question?
Yep.
Yes, there's one right here.
Probably a microphone, so hopefully I'm loud enough. We've touched briefly on copyright law being 50 years and arts law being 75 years. And I think Ferrari did that with the GTO, and they proved the GTO is art. So is that the answer, that the car is art by definition of law?
That's one for you, Clive.
The lower court, which is the judge in the commercial court in Bologna, which is quite close to Ferrari, probably got a bit overexcited because everything's red in that part of the world. If you turn up with a Porsche silver, you have to be careful. The subsequent court decided that they hadn't used their copyright design in 5 or 6 years, and therefore applied an odd rule called use it or lose it. And so Ferrari lost. Now, that doesn't match in with the Jaguar case, so I don't think the issue is settled yet where copyright is going. And there will be more cases. And I think I would say that anybody with a replica that exists already should go about mind their own business with it. Anybody thinking of buying one should be very careful. I think what set the whole chain of events off was publicly declaring that small numbers of cars would be made at considerable sums of money. And that forced the manufacturers to say, well, hang on, we need to protect our history. Coming back to the FIA thing, the grids at Goodwood are full of beautiful cars, and there's probably only 2 or 3. I mean, I've got a client who's given up running his GT40 because he won't play the game of upping the spec. And all the rest of them are 20% faster, so he's at the back of the grid and he's given up. But the argument there is that if they hadn't been condoned, that kind of racing would have disappeared. Yeah. So if they're perfect copies and there's a reasonable purpose, Ferrari are not going to single out anybody, neither the Jaguar, neither the Jaguar is. But if someone says we're going to make 50 short wheelbases, then they're going to be in trouble.
Oh, incidentally, and I don't quite know what to say about this, but there is a car in the Concours made by Ray Mallock Limited, which kind of looks like a short wheelbase that's been left out in the sun. What on earth, when Ferrari are particularly litigious, what's going to happen to that car? What was the point of building that? Anybody know?
Simon, I'm involved in that car deeply, and I can tell you that
Sorry, can we get a microphone to that gentleman, because this sounds interesting.
Simon, my name's Damon Benyon. I'm the founder of Benyon Law, one of the leading collector car legal practices. I am closely involved with that car, and I can tell you there are no issues with Ferrari.
There are no
issues
with Ferrari.
Yeah.
Even though it calls itself a short wheelbase or an SWB, have Ferrari officially told you that they don't mind?
I think we need to be careful with too much more detail, but what I can tell you is there are no issues with that car.
Right. All right.
That's
a wise answer.
Quite popular, I don't use elaborate this, but if you've got the design, it's mathematically there, you know, digitally or otherwise, and if you change it more than 7%, which means if I took that Ferrari and moved surfaces around, but it still sort of looks like it, and then I don't think it falls into copyright.
Right.
Because it's a percentage of change that goes beyond the protection, I believe.
Very soon we're going to have to stop.
Simon, can I jump in one more thing? I've been
Yes, go ahead.
I've got the microphone, just changing the subject a little bit, and it touches on tax, and particularly what Susan said earlier. I think there's a word of caution for all of us when we talk about cars and art, and maybe most of us know this in the room, but at the moment we all have the benefit of our cars being a wasting asset, a thing that wears out. Long may that continue.
Yeah.
Quite agree. Yes, Susan.
So the point on that is that we all talk about them as wasting assets, but we know we have valuations going back to, 1907-ish? Slightly more than 50 years. Wasting asset is supposed to be something which basically has a useful life of less than 50 years. So when we get into a chattel being a wasting asset in this case, it's a bit like a wristwatch. It's mechanical. And the fact that it is mechanical deems it to be a wasting asset. So the question, I think, arises at what point will HMRC perhaps sit up a bit straighter and change the rules? Of course they won't, because otherwise that means when you buy your normal car that sits on your drive for £20,000 and sell it for £10,000, you can have a loss for capital gains tax purposes.
So that's fascinating, because like so many of us, I've been kind of keeping my head down thinking, I mean, you know, a little car that I bought for £30,000, which is now worth £100,000, I'm terrified that the law will get changed. You're saying that HMRC won't change it because of the other way around it?
Will they? If they did, I don't think they could change it for your normal car that you buy and you absolutely know will depreciate. Whether they will do something at the other end, but again, fashions change. You know, you could have bought your wonderful car for hundreds of thousands of pounds and actually take a bit of a bath on it, because when you come to sell it, it's out of fashion. So there are still swings and roundabouts. And at the moment, we are still in the world of it is mechanical at its heart. We've talked about it made of thousands and thousands of pieces. So that is what we are hanging on to at the moment in terms of being outside the scope of capital gains tax.
Long may it continue.
Long may it continue.
Have we got another question? Yes, sir.
Can I just do one other thing?
We've got one there and one there.
Thank you. My question, perhaps it's too big a question, but it's about the future of the collector car market, which Burton feels really health, feels really robust. Values not just for the likes of the 250 GTO, but sub £100,000 cars. For those of the 80s and 90s seem to be incredibly robust. So when we look forwards, we've got an environment of a push towards electric cars. The market doesn't seem to have really reacted to that. And when you think about some of the principles we're talking about art, well, if electric cars become more common, fossil fuels disappear, we use a utility. The reality is most of us couldn't put our cars on the wall and we can't wear them on our wrist. So for a lot of us that are sitting on substantial assets and really valuable assets, is there a point in time where they become worthless? And why is the market so robust at the moment, seemingly not reacting to what seems to lie in the future?
John, you spend every day looking at that.
I do, and I can't really quickly answer that one. I think that I believe very strongly that in 100 years' time there'll still be cars with ICE engines driving around Goodwood and Silverstone and up the hill at Shelsley, and whatever else happens, and even if, I said yesterday on the talk, that even if there's flux capacitors powering the car, it doesn't matter. You know, that will still happen, because that will be that is part of, you know, it's just something I can't see that changing.
Is that part of the philosophy that those of us who have cars over 40 years old don't have to have MOTs? If we drive into central London, we're not. Is it because the classic car business in the DVLA or lawmakers world is too tiny to be worried about?
Again, there's not a quick question to that. I really don't know where to start. I mean, I'm doing another talk about the market in general later on this afternoon. But DVLA, you know, they have some very strange ideas. I think that we have seen very early Teslas already pick up as a collectible car. I think that's interesting. I think that things like the McMurtry fan car, which we talked about earlier on, that is such an extraordinary car. It doesn't matter what powers that will always be an absolutely iconic, important car. And it's an extraordinary car. So I think, you know, and also, you know, there are loads of very big companies putting a lot of money into alternative e-fuels, and we saw very recently the change in EU legislation, which means that e-fuels will be allowed to continue after what was a ban. So it's a very changing environment.
We had one more question over here, I think. Yes, sir.
Actually, it was a very similar question. When I was a boy, my dad bought an AC Cobra Mark II for £11,000. I spoke to him this morning. I think he thought it'd been driven by 10 miles around the turbo ring. I see there's one out there for £500,000. So what can I buy today for £11,000 that's going to be worth £500,000?
Don't we all wish we knew?
I'm always asked this question, and it's always the last question. It's like, what should I buy? Buy what you love, because then you cannot be disappointed. You can't be disappointed with whether it goes up or down in value. And if you keep it for a year or 20 years, then you get that 4 o'clock in the morning drive out of it, and you enjoy it. And also, then you're not tied in. Pretty much everybody I know has bought cars for money and sticks them away in garages. It's not a car; it's an asset. An asset is boring. You know, it's the reason that ICEs, they're great, but they're nowhere near as good as a Triumph at 4 o'clock in the morning.
That's an absolutely wonderful note. Thank you, John, to end. Thank you all, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us. This is a cliche, but we really could sit here with all of you asking questions and hearing the words of wisdom and wit from our very distinguished panel. I wish we could go on all day. Sadly, we can't, although maybe we will think of a way of spending a day with gentlemen like this talking, and ladies like this talking about whether cars are art. Whether they are art or not, don't we all love them? Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.